Welcome and thank you for joining us for this fourth panel session on U.S. election reform, seen through the lens of the 2005 Carter-Baker Federal Election Commission. My name is David Carroll. I'm the director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. And we're co-organizing this panel series with Rice University's Becker Institute for Public Policy. The Carter Center and the Becker Institute are both nonpartisan organizations founded by former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker III. 16 years ago, President Carter and Secretary Baker came together to co-chair a bipartisan commission on election reform to try to find ways to help build confidence in US elections. Today, debate about election reform continues to rage. Americans are deeply divided, and politicians seem more interested in scoring political points than in really trying to have constructive discussions about election reform. In the spirit of the Carter-Baker Commission, we thought it was important to try to bring together smart, reasonable people who can have serious discussion about election reform and ways to strengthen democracy and elections in the United States. We're lucky to have with us today a group of highly respected election officials and experts who will speak to us about key issues related to technology and elections. Our panelists are Veronica DeGraffenreid, who's the acting secretary of the Commonwealth and special advisor on election modernization in the Pennsylvania Department of State. Brian Macias, who's the founder of RSM Election Solutions and was formerly was the acting director of testing and certification at the US Election Assistance Commission. Monica Childers, who's the product manager for risk limiting audits at VotingWorks, and Dan Wallach, who's professor of computer sciences and electrical and computer engineering at Rice University and a faculty scholar with the Becker Institute. He was also an advisor to the Carter-Baker Commission. And once again, our moderator for the discussion today is Doug Chapin, who's the director of election research at the Forrest Marsh Group. And he served as the director of research for the 2005 Carter-Baker Commission. We're going to kick things off with a short video, after which Doug and our panelists will start the discussion. At the conclusion of the session today, my colleague from the Becker Institute, John Williams, will offer a few closing remarks and provide some information about the fifth and last session on June 2nd. Thank you all.
In 2005, the United States was in its fifth year of efforts to reform its election system. The hotly contested and controversial 2000 presidential election had identified flaws in the nation's registration and voting laws that were seen to contribute to a lack of confidence in election outcomes. A 2002 bill called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, addressed some of those issues, but failed to settle all of the arguments that had arisen around election reform. For example, state laws requiring voters to provide photo identification were generating backlash amid claims of disenfranchisement. Worry about new voting technology was leading to fears of counting errors. And growing numbers of absentee and mail ballots were raising concerns about the possibility of fraud. In response, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker III agreed to co-chair a bipartisan commission housed at Washington, D.C.'s American University to examine these and other outstanding election reform issues. The final report, entitled Building Confidence in U.S. Elections, stressed the important role of elections to the nation's democracy and made a series of recommendations, some controversial at the time, that sought to protect access to polls and the integrity of the election process. Today, many of the challenges that the Commission recognized have been addressed and are now familiar aspects of the American voting experience. Yet they remain central to current election reform debates. In this panel series, we are revisiting key issues in the Carter-Baker report and assessing how they can help foster constructive dialogue on election reforms. Today's topic is voting technology. On this issue, the 2005 Commission report noted that voting machines should be equipped with a voter-verifiable paper audit trail and be fully accessible to voters with disabilities. To support developments in the field, the report also urged research and development of new technologies to enhance transparency, security, and auditability of voting systems. Recognizing the importance of audits, the Commission also recommended that state and local election authorities publicly test all types of voting machines before, during, and after Election Day. In the 16 years since the Commission issued its recommendations, The issue of voting technology has undergone almost constant change. In today's discussion, we'll look more closely at this issue with a special focus on audits and system certification, keeping in mind the ultimate goal of building confidence in U.S. elections. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Chapin, and I am your moderator and host for today's session on voting technology. I will note that those of us on this end of the webinar had the same issues with the volume on the video going up and down. Hopefully we will get that cleaned up so that folks can see that again in the future, but we are glad that you are with us and still with us today. I am neither an election official nor an expert, but I'm delighted to be included in the group of what David calls, I hope, smart and reasonable people, and really looking forward to the conversation today. I want to thank our panelists for being here. Just to give you a quick sense of how the day will go, we'll start off with 4 very quick opening round questions to each of our panelists, just to give them a chance to introduce themselves and get us into the conversation. We'll then have a moderated discussion where we throw questions out to the panel and let folks respond and have a conversation. And then at the end, we hope to have time for your questions. If you have a question that you'd like to ask the panel or any one of the panelists, please type it into the Q&A button you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll pull those together and make sure we get to as many as we can before the end of our time later this afternoon. But with that, I'm going to jump right into the panel. I'm going to start with Secretary DeGraffenreid from Pennsylvania. Secretary DeGraffenreid, I know you've been in state election administration for years. Managing technology has always been a big part of the work that you do. What are your thoughts on the current state of the field of voting and elections technology?
Right, thank you. And thank you for allowing me to participate today. You know, it's interesting, in February, just in February of this year, just as I became acting secretary of the Commonwealth, you know, the EAC's, you know, voluntary voting systems guidelines, VVSG 2.0 was adopted, you know, just a few days after I became, you know, acting secretary. And these standards are I think maybe the 5th iteration of national voting system standards, you know, since going back to the Federal Election Commission, and they published their first 2 sets. And so I think it's important to know that these are rigorous new standards that contain, I guess, critically important improvements to for voter privacy, usability, accessibility, and certainly security. The voting technology is, you know, points to the future of like what we need with respect to administering elections, you know, here in the United States. Certainly voting machines are tested, you know, at a federal level, but we also do our own rigorous testing here in the Commonwealth. And it's interesting because although those standards were adopted this year, it was really, you know, 15 or 16 years, like right after, you know, the Carter-Baker Commission really adopted their recommendations, and we had VVSG 1.0. And now, you know, 15 plus years later, VVSG 2.0. So the progress is slow when it comes to modernization. So I just thought that was the first thing that's extremely interesting. And one of the recommendations, right, from the Carter-Baker was certainly having a verifiable, voter verifiable paper audit trail. And it was important that, you know, VVSG 2.0, you know, really pointed to that. But prior to that, most states, and I was previously in North Carolina, now here in the Commonwealth, and in both of those states, that's where we, you know, that's where we ended up, especially after the 2016 election, when elections became critical infrastructure. So I think it was important to note that. I mean, that progress is slow, but that even though, you know, those standards were just adopted, states certainly were taking efforts and taking those recommendations seriously. And I can certainly speak more.
No, that's
Yes.
fine. I should probably just turn my mic on. But you Zoom thing, and I'm still forgetting to hit that button. Thank you, Secretary. And actually, Secretary DeGraffenreid mentions the development of new systems and standards. This question is for Ryan. Obviously, Ryan, she's playing your entrance music when she talks about voting machine systems and standards. In your view, what are some of the biggest strides forward in the field of standards and testing since Carter-Baker was released in 2005? And welcome.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Baker Institute and Carter Center for having me today. And first and foremost, thank you to the audience too for being here to listen to this discussion. Obviously, technology is a main part of elections, particularly in today's world. And watching it transition since 2005, I actually came into this industry less than a month after the original report came out. And so as Secretary had mentioned, the 2005 VVSG, Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, were just getting enacted and just getting started. And I was at that time at the California Secretary of State's office. We had just decertified paperless DREs based on, in conjunction with the recommendation here. And so what I would say is from that transition over the last 16 years, there's been multiple things. First and foremost, coming out of 2016 has been the designation of critical infrastructure. And the designation of critical infrastructure has broadened our viewpoint and our understanding of what is election technology. And I want to be very specific on that term. Election technology is the whole of the industry, and it's all technologies that are that facilitate elections. And guidelines, which are very specific from the election industry, is that we need standards and we need protocols around all election technology. And so while we are not there yet, we are having a better understanding that we need to build and develop standards around all of these technologies. And many of the states are beginning to adopt that themselves. And hopefully we'll get to a point where the federal government will have some sort of, even if it's not standards, at least have some best practices and some testing regimens around that. Next would be around accessibility and usability. There have been many strides in that field. When we first came out, it was DREs and DREs only. And now you're starting to see the development and not just around accessibility, which was the key term originally, but we started to look at accessibility and somewhat we're forgetting about the usability of the accessibility devices and the accessibility technology. And so there has been strides in the usability front. And in conjunction with the critical infrastructure designation, obviously we've seen movements in security around evidence-based elections and the ability to be able to audit elections, also building resiliency in the entire process. And the last thing, which was actually a recommendation, but mainly around the voter registration system, but we are seeing this in voting systems as well, is interoperability. And so going back to 2005, most systems did not talk to one another. And so there was a concern and an issue of the types of manual data entry that had to be done and the replication and inefficiencies of moving from one system to another. And, now with common data formats, we are starting to see integration in data formats and in interoperability from voter registration all the way through reporting and then into the canvas through auditing. And so those are the major topics, but would be willing to dive into those a little bit more as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you and welcome. And it's almost like I planned it. You all are doing a beautiful job. You mentioned the topic of auditing, and I want to turn to my friend and colleague, Monica Childers, who I know has studied and worked in the area of audits for quite a while. Monica, I know you can probably talk for hours about the nuts and bolts of auditing. But given that auditing has become more prevalent, especially risk limiting audits across the country, can you tell us a little bit about what's involved in a risk limiting audit and how states and some localities are working to put those into practice?
Sure, absolutely. So starting off at the most basic, what's an audit? An audit is any process that election officials go through to do quality assurance, to make sure things went correctly, went as expected. In general, you're looking for errors with machines in places where we use machines, whether that's voter registration, whether that's e-poll books, whether that's ballot marking devices, whether that's tabulators that actually count the votes. You're also looking for errors in humans. Elections are a really complicated process. I think most people who haven't actually worked in elections are often shocked by how complicated they are. And it's also a human process. A lot of this stuff is done manually still. And so anytime you combine humans and complicated processes, you get errors. So audits can also check for human errors. In general, you can think of them like quality assurance processes in that they are routine parts of the election system. So this is not like a financial audit where I think some people get confused that we might do an audit because we think something has gone wrong. That's not the way we look at audits in elections. You really want them to be a consistent part of the process. You might not audit every single thing every election, but you do want it to be consistent. And the reason for that is there are lots of problems that occur that you might not have any notion have happened. So you need it to be something that you do without suspicion of anything going wrong. It just needs to be a standard part of the elections process. There are lots of different types of audits and they all have a different scope and are looking for different things. There's no such thing as sort of one audit to rule them all. They all have different purposes. So there may be a good reason to do multiple different kinds of audits, and most states have sort of a layered audit system if they have any audit system at all. In the different kinds of audits, you can have things like procedural audits that check for, did you comply with all the laws? Did you put all your required legal notices in the newspaper and things like that? You can have things like forensic audits, which will look at a computer system to see if there's been tampering or make sure the programming is correct. And then you can have something like an RLA. So an RLA stands for risk limiting audit. And that's a fancy term for an audit we do to make sure that the tabulators got the right winner. So this audit is focused specifically on checking the tabulators that count the votes on the ballots. Even with voting systems that produce voter verifiable paper audit trails like we all have now, you still have one set of equipment, machinery, that stands between that voter verifiable paper ballot and the tallies and the results at the end of the election. And that's the tabulators that count the votes. So this is specifically securing that part of the election process with the tabulators counting the votes. Now, the simplest thing to do if you want to make sure that the votes are counted correctly is to count them all by hand. And we have a process for that. It's called a recount. But recounts are incredibly expensive in terms of time and money. So most states only allow for them in very limited circumstances. And again, because we want these audits to be a consistent standard part of the process, a recount isn't necessarily appropriate for that. So about a decade ago, a little over, statisticians figured out that you don't have to hand count every ballot to actually get a very high degree of confidence that the tabulators did give you the right winner. Not that every vote was counted correctly, but that enough of them were counted correctly so that the winner, the right person, is seated in the legislature or in Congress or whatever. And to do that, we look at a random sample of paper ballots. We examine them by hand. We note the results that we see on those ballots, and then we compare the results in that sample, that random sample, to what we got originally from the tabulators. Different flavors of RLAs compare different things. Some of them are looking at an individual ballot and saying, did the tabulator count this particular ballot the same way that a human did? Some of them actually look at a group of ballots and say, is the margin in this group of ballots close to what we would expect if the tabulator had done it correctly? So it's all aimed at giving us a look into whether the winner was correct. The real genius of an RLA, though, is that it doesn't scale the way you think it might. So if you're doing a recount and you have a small local election that has 10,000 votes, that's 10,000 ballots. If you have a statewide election that has millions of votes, you'd have to recount millions of ballots. RLAs don't scale that way. RLAs, the number of ballots that you look at actually depends on the margin of the win in the contest. So if you have a candidate that won by 10% and the RLA says, great, you need to look at 400 ballots. That's 400 ballots in a local contest with the 10,000 ballots that was won by 10%. That's also 400 ballots in a statewide contest that was won by 10%, even if there are millions of ballots. So for particularly these very large races, statewide races, national races, things like that, the number of ballots you have to look at in an RLA is entirely dependent on that margin, and can provide you some amazing savings, again, while still delivering that high degree of confidence. And we audit for two reasons. We audit to boost public confidence so that the public can know that we are checking our work as election officials and we have gotten the right results. We also audit to learn things and make our own processes better. One of the things that we've discovered over the past several years in sort of scaling risk limiting audits up tremendously is that election officials, every time they audit, they learn something new about other processes, whether that's chain of custody of ballots, or how they're organizing their scanning process as they put them through the tabulators, or how they're organizing their storage. Jurisdictions are learning from each other and learning how to make their own processes better, both within the audit and outside it. So there are sort of dual purposes, both learning from the election official side and increasing public confidence.
Fantastic, thank you. And kudos for sneaking in the Tolkien reference in your remarks. So +10 to you. Let me bring in Professor Wallach. Dan, you were an advisor to the original commission and have long been a proponent for improved security of voting technology. What kind of strides or developments have you seen in the field since the original report in 2005?
Wow, so there have been a series of important changes since 2005. In 2007 or 8, we had states of California, Ohio, and Florida doing analyses of the security of these paperless DRE electronic voting machines and largely finding serious problems. I was one of the people who worked with the California Secretary of State that year. And as a direct result, you can draw a straight line from that to, in the most recent election, we have many more voters voting either on hand-marked paper or machine-marked paper. And that directly allowed the 2020 election to be much more secure, much more recountable. I mean, you can look directly at the recounts in the state of Georgia this past November and say these recounts would not have been possible with Georgia's original paperless voting system. And I think that's a huge big deal. Other important changes, the secretary mentioned that we have this designation of voting infrastructure as critical infrastructure. That happened after the 2016 election. And what that did is it freed up DHS resources to do security consulting, just to help state and local election officials improve their computer security, intrusion detection, password management, backup management, the sort of basic stuff that everybody has to do right. And it's important to do that. And it's often hard to do that. But and consultants normally cost a lot of money, but when you can get it from the federal government for free, why not? And so this is where the federal government really assisted the states, not in a way that that anybody was compelled to help, but they were helpful and appreciated for it. So I think all of these things have had a huge impact.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, that tee-up. I think we do live in a much different world now than we did back in the original era of the Carter-Baker report. With the panel's indulgence, I want to start with kind of a big question that loops in our conversations on other panels as well. This was in the video, but for those of you who might not have been able to hear it, one of the big overarching themes in the Carter-Baker report and in the deliberations that produced it was the need not just to balance access to the vote and the integrity of the process, but to look for ways to improve both of them simultaneously. So, let me start with kind of a big question to the panel. In what ways do you think the developments we've seen in the last 16 years have contributed both to improved access to voting by eligible voters and improved the integrity of the process overall. And I won't cold call. Everyone feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start on that one. First and foremost, going back to, Secretary had mentioned the latest voluntary voting system guidelines version 2.0. As you know, when I was at the EAC, but even going back to prior to me being at the EAC when I was in California and part of the standards board, this was one of the things that we were trying to tackle and making sure that there wasn't a differentiation between access and security. And one of the things that, I was most proud of while I was at the EAC in 2017, the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, which Dan is a part of, came together and said, you know what, we're tired of hearing these conversations of accessibility and security butting heads together. It is neither an either or, it is both. And so they came together, and the accessibility community and the security community developed a resolution that said, voting in short, voting systems must be accessible and secure. This is not an either or. And so that helped frame the entire next set of standards, was going at it with that approach, is how do we bring this together? Also, Dan had mentioned about the California top to bottom review, the Everest report. Coming out of that, what we have seen is a lot of states that are doing security and accessibility testing, which has leveraged other states who may not have the capacity to be able to do that on their own, to look at the others and say, okay, if it's accessible for this community in this state, if it's accessible for, if it's secure for this state, then we can go ahead and leverage their certifications and know that the systems are good enough for our voters as well. And so we're seeing that collaboration across states as well.
Secretary DeGraffenreid, any thoughts? Obviously, I know you've worked in both North Carolina and now Pennsylvania. I imagine balancing and looking ways to maximize both access and integrity are always front and center. I know you mentioned that Pennsylvania has a fairly robust testing system for its voting equipment. Any thoughts on how that all works together, both to ensure or assure people of the integrity of the process, but also create or protect access to voters?
Right. So, in addition to providing, not just accessibility for purposes of people who may need it for physical impairments, but just, opportunities to vote as well. I think we have to, really take a step back and just looking at the overall process with elections administration, not just with voting equipment, but also with the other things that Ryan mentioned in his earlier comments, that really election technology is not just the voting equipment, it's voter registration, it's e-poll books, it's election night reporting. And we're looking at that technology, making sure that it's secure, making sure that there can be confidence in all that we do. There's also that underlying, theme of just making sure that we are absolutely making voting easier and expanding opportunities for people to vote as well. So I've seen that, certainly in North Carolina with early voting. So early voting that would, allow the use of electronic poll books to make it easier for poll workers to find voters and to ensure that they are absolutely selecting the right voter, so that is the person who they're going to issue the correct ballot to. That is expanding access to voting, and there's integrity, in that process. We also saw the need of making sure that the election reporting website was easier for people to understand, and that there was more information that you could provide to people who were interested in the results, and slicing and dicing those numbers at the precinct level and at the voting method level. There are individuals who are looking at voter turnout, and they're comparing those numbers to those participation numbers to the number of ballots cast. All of that is now in, very much the forefront of elections administration. So I would say that certainly making sure that there's accuracy and integrity in the technology, but also just making sure that people have confidence in what the information that they're seeing is something that is very much important to elections administration.
If I can piggyback on that quickly, I think one of the things that I've been most excited to see is a recognition of how important transparency is to the whole elections process, especially with how complicated it is and continues to become more complicated every passing year. This stuff doesn't get simpler, it gets more complicated. You're starting to see voting systems, which are historically made by for-profit companies that are black boxes where the code is not available for anyone to review, things like that. You're starting to see nonprofits get into the space, open source voting systems where the code is all online and can be viewed by anyone. And, LA County built their own voting system recently and decided that it should be entirely open source. My own nonprofit has been building open source voting systems. So the idea that we're really starting to recognize that a black box model for voting technology where nobody but the company who designed it can really see how it works is not something that inspires trust. That's really important. And you're also seeing the transparency aspect carry through to election official offices where they're starting to realize that more data and more data transparency and doing it consistently year over year over year so that people can see a track record of transparency when questions arise. You're not just putting data out once it looks like there may have been a problem, but you can point to a track record of having consistently published data. When there are questions about how are people being taken off the voter rolls and why and things like that, states that produce a schedule of when that activity takes place and the criteria for what takes place and the numbers of how many people were changed or added or dropped, that really helps to reassure people that election officials are being transparent about these processes. It's nothing new, it's nothing different, it's the same process we go through every year. And I think that especially because people's attention tends to go up and down about elections, depending on how the election cycle is going and how politically contentious it is. That consistency can really help when people are just popping in to see what's going on at any particular time, to see that there's been consistent attention to being transparent and accountable is really helpful.
One of the things that I thought about when I was thinking about this panel is that when I came into elections, I was thinking about this also, Monica, with your comments about having transparency, but really, Doug, to your question about making sure that we're providing access while not, and certainly being secure, but not sacrificing access. One of the things that was very much in the national discussion in 2008, there was a portion of this country that we're talking about, one of the ways that we can make voting and more accessible is certainly internet voting, right? That was absolutely for some individuals something that we should be looking at. After 2016, I don't think anyone is thinking about internet voting, is certainly not here in the United States, as a way to expand opportunities for people to vote, not for typical civilian voters, and even military and overseas voters. There's this, okay, we want to make sure that there's access to voting, but we don't want to sacrifice security. So although we absolutely, as elections administrators, want to ensure that people have an opportunity, have access to voting, certainly access to voter registration, we can only go so far because security is also equally as important. I feel like sometimes when I'm talking, I'm lulling you guys to sleep.
No, not at all. For some reason, my it's not cooperating. Somehow I suspected that the discussion of internet voting might result in Dan Wallach turning his camera on.
Yeah, I have many things I could say about internet voting. If you talk to people in Switzerland, they'll say 40% of Swiss voting citizens live outside of the borders of the country. So of course we need to have internet voting. Well, maybe not. It's convenient, it's nice. And with COVID also, oh, anything else is dangerous, the internet is safe. So maybe we should have internet voting. And a lot of experts have spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how can we do internet voting? And you run into a large number of deeply difficult, unsolved technical problems. How do I even know what the voter's email address is? How can I figure out that the voter on their phone is the same voter who registered? How do I know that it's the voter and not their spouse? There are really complicated, and what do I do about voters who don't have the internet, who have an older phone that doesn't have all the same security features? Whenever people say, oh, we should vote on the blockchain, well, then you go and look at all of the weird fraud modes that happen in the cryptocurrency space, and you say, this would not be acceptable in an election. Things have to be not just we have to get the right answer, but we have to have enough transparency, like we were just talking about, to go back and audit the results and convince ourselves that they were correct. And when we think about how many people have malware on their computers, that how do I know that it's the voter voting and not the malware voting on behalf of the voter? Internet voting, I wish I could say it was coming soon, but really it's at least a decade away, if not more.
Right. So we're back to paper. In the year 2021, we're saying paper, which is, unbelievable when you think about other things that we do in our lives. Because of COVID, there are, my bank, for instance, has decided that they are okay with just being, online banking, and, they're not going to have a brick and mortar, because that will save them money, and people want to bank, mobile banking anyway. And so now there's technology that will allow you to scan your check and you get money immediately, right? So we're used to this instant gratification, a way of living in the world, but not with voting. So paper, and we're also, voting by mail. It's a thing. And of course, the Postal Service is supposed to be bankrupt. No one sends mail anymore. I have kids who are, one is a teenager and two are, college age. I think they've been in a post office maybe twice, and that may be a stretch of their entire lives. So now we're doing, we're encouraging vote by mail. So, it's kind of weird when you think about it, with elections administration, that we are saying, because of the transparency, because of the accountability, sometimes the way that we've been doing it for quite a while is absolutely okay, except that we do have to have some level of modern technology to help move us along.
Yeah, I've often joked that when it comes to internet voting, that the consensus is that we will have it someday, but the way to start a fight is to get people to decide when that someday will be. That's usually when the sharp elbows start flying. Let me turn to another topic that I know is hard for officials and experts alike to grapple with, but I think is really important in the real world of election administration, and that's the cost, specifically the cost of technology. The money it takes to buy and maintain voting machines and election technology is a very real non-zero part of election officials' budgets. Secretary DeGraffenreid, I'll start with you, but I'd love to hear what everyone else thinks. How has the issue of cost affected the ability of election offices specifically and the field generally to keep pace? And are there best practices or some new thinking on how we might do this, short of just getting policymakers to make more money available for voting technology?
Well, policymakers need to make more money available for elections in general. So two things that I think happened, I can say from personal experience, both in North Carolina and in Pennsylvania. In North Carolina, counties were able to use some of the election security grants to purchase new equipment. So they got the money and they used the money, for those cases. Here in Pennsylvania, prior to my start, the bipartisan Act of 2019 allowed for grants for counties to purchase new voting equipment. Again, in both of those states, just this renewed interest in making sure that voters had a verifiable paper audit trail. So DREs went away, and DREs in North Carolina actually were decertified, needed to be decertified due to statute. So hence the need. Yes, they absolutely needed money for that. So state of Pennsylvania, gave counties grants. They still had to, I guess, fund a portion of it, and then counties here use elections grants to purchase new voting equipment. However, big thing that is always, and sometimes county commissioners don't always understand truly the cost of elections, that it is recurring. You do have, for every election, ballot coding, ballot printing, and whenever they add like new things in the law, well, you need to put something special on your election day ballots versus your provisional ballots versus, whatever. All of that adds up to additional costs, for counties. So the more rules that they put in place, and I'm not speaking about whether they're good or bad, it comes at a cost, for counties. And it's not just voting equipment and, the ballots, it's electronic poll books. We think that's a great, wonderful thing. Okay, well, that costs money. New laws, something that is really prevalent with, in elections administration right now, is absolutely the need to engage with voters, to communicate with voters. So we're seeing election offices now, they need a press plan or a communications plan. You need people with the skill set to be able to do that or to pay for that. And there's just innumerable, things that we can speak to that are costing election offices now that people don't always think about.
So one thing that we could probably add with regard to cost is that it's a relatively small market for equipment for voting. There are basically 3 players, and one of them has a substantial fraction of the market. And what that means is that the prices that they're charging are not really connected in any meaningful way to the manufacturing and research and development costs. So election officials are getting overcharged for equipment. And there are several different alternatives to this that may or may not ultimately see major, impact on the market. I mean, Monica works for a not-for-profit called Voting Works that's trying to do they're a not-for-profit. So that means they're not trying to make money. They're trying to build technologies. And Voting Works isn't the only one. Los Angeles County, California built their own voting machine. There's another startup out of Portland called Free and Fair, and there will probably be others as well, both in the US and internationally. And there's no reason why a voting machine shouldn't cost any more or less than a cheap laptop that you buy down at the store. And maybe they should be built out of cheap laptops. So that way the warranty and maintenance costs can be lower too.
And actually, Ryan, I think that goes a little bit to your issue of interoperability. My boyish good looks aside, I've been using personal computers for several decades. And I remember back in the old days that when you bought a personal computer, you bought the whole thing from the same manufacturer, right down to the printer. And nowadays, as I sit here in my home office, I think I have half a dozen or more different manufacturers involved in everything from communications to lighting. Does interoperability hold out some promise for maybe helping election offices address cost?
It's not the panacea. I want to start with that. There's a few things I want to hit on that that Dan talked about, and same with the secretary had talked about, is number one, we just need to get an ongoing stream of funding. When you look back to HAVA and the way that it was implemented, there was one large tranche of money. We've now had two more large tranches of money that have come in. But that's not the model in which election officials conduct elections, number one, nor is it the way in which they are purchasing their equipment now, because the elections technology, to your point, Doug, are keeping up more with the times now, whereby we're using commercial off-the-shelf technologies. So things that you can go and purchase from your technology store and be able to replace them on an ongoing basis. And so we need the funding to meet those same needs, where the election official can, replace things as necessary. And we've started to see the market change in that fashion also, whereby people are not purchasing their voting technologies anymore, or even their election technologies writ large. Rather, they're starting to lease the equipment so that they can replace that on an ongoing basis. And yet our funding streams have not met the needs of our elections officials in the same fashion. Now to the point of interoperability, some of that will be able to be addressed if we have that ongoing funding, because I may only need to replace my computer today. And next year, I may need to replace my printer. The next year, I may need to replace my precinct scanner, or I may need to replace my central count scanner. And so being able to change these things out on an ongoing basis and on an as needed basis really needs to fit the same model of funding. And but again, the technology needs to keep up, and interoperability will allow for some of that. To your point, Doug, our voting technologies up until this point have been more like the decades ago, where you bought everything holistically. You bought the hardware, you bought the software, and you got it all from one provider who gave you your technology and stuck with you for the next decade. And so we are seeing that change over time and at an exponential rate. But again, the funding needs to keep up with the same way in which our election technologies are being purchased.
And Monica, I know Dan has mentioned a couple of times that Voting Works has evolved. I also know that you have been interested just in election purchasing and procurement generally. Any thoughts on the interaction between what election offices need and what they can afford to buy on this issue?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing that there's reminding ourselves of is that this is an equity issue. I mean, the reason Voting Works is a nonprofit is partly because we believe that election systems should be publicly owned. They are paid for by taxpayer dollars. That should be at the best cost possible. And anyone who says you can't provide them at a lower cost is just lying, because you absolutely can. However, we're also a nonprofit because what happens when you have jurisdictions of different sizes with different budgets, keep in mind that most election purchases are made by counties or sometimes by cities and towns. Sometimes states provide funding to their local jurisdictions as well. But, this is the same budget that streetlights and pothole fixes and your local police force, those are all things coming out of this same budget. So an election that happens every year, every 2 years, every 4 years, when people are paying attention, is sometimes hard to advocate for. And it turns into an issue where well-resourced, wealthier jurisdictions have the best equipment, the newest equipment, the most user-friendly equipment. They have the ballots that are newly redesigned and easier for voters to understand, so that more voters actually get their votes counted in the way that they intended, things like that. And then you have the more rural, the less wealthy jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions just don't have the funding. And so you have an enormous equity gap in how we conduct our elections between richer places and poorer places. And that crosses all other demographic boundaries. But you really have to start to think, because the technology matters so much in how elections are administered and how easy it is to get there, to vote, especially if you're someone who needs accessibility, and then to have your votes counted as you intended. That creates a huge problem if we can't have systems that are equitable, whether you live in a richer county or a poorer county. So I think reminding ourselves that this isn't just something where, oh, election officials want more money and, oh, the purchasing schedules have changed. It's also an issue where, you know, people are using 10, 20-year-old voting equipment, not because they want to. It's literally because they don't have the funding, they can't convince their local government to give it to them, or the local government doesn't have the tax base to provide it. And so the rubber really meets the road in that way.
And also it comes at a cost, right? So going back to our access to voting and opportunities, it's not just the voting equipment, but let's talk about by mail voting, vote by mail voting. I mean, now we have jurisdictions, they've never done this before. So here in the Commonwealth, the counties, we've always had absentee voting, but last year was the first time with no excuse by mail voting, and it was done like during the midst of a pandemic. So what is additional costs with vote by mail? You have mail houses, right? Counties using mail houses for the first time. That came at a cost. Although we don't have signature verification here in the Commonwealth, other states that do use vote by mail, certainly they're paying for that type of equipment. Just the mail processing equipment itself, I mean, certainly the larger counties here did use some of the funding that they had access to get mail processing equipment so that they can process those ballots a lot quicker. And then, you know, two key things: the use of drop boxes and satellite election offices or early vote centers. And so Monica is spot on that you have some jurisdictions that can provide more opportunities for people to be able to come in and vote or return their ballot, and it becomes, you know, it is an equity issue. Some counties did not provide that or felt that they could not provide that because of resources and in elections to come. We have an election tomorrow. Last year, counties had access to funding. This year, not so much. And so we have seen a drop in the number of counties that are providing things like drop boxes and what's called satellite election offices here in the Commonwealth. So it is important that counties and local jurisdictions and state, the state jurisdiction as well, are adequately funded.
So on that topic of equity, I want to go back to something that was mentioned in the video, and I know we've touched on a little bit here and there, but I want to talk specifically about accessibility for voters with disabilities. I know that's been an ongoing issue in the field. It was in many ways the undercard of the battle over touchscreen electronic machines and paper-based voting systems. I will not presume to know what the best way is to deal with it. I appreciate that everyone here has mentioned that it is not an either or, but a both and. But thinking about making that both and a reality, where are we on accessibility for voters with disabilities, recognizing that that describes a whole wide range of conditions in the election space?
Right, so I'll start with saying that, you know, if you're coming to vote, it depends on the jurisdiction. So let's talk about voting in person. In a state like North Carolina, people who needed to present to vote in person had an option. Number one, they didn't have to go into a polling location. They could take advantage of curbside voting. If they did want to go inside the voting enclosure, there was accessible voting equipment at every single polling location. That was North Carolina law, that it would be provided. If you wanted to have assistance in voting, absolutely, that was afforded to you. Where, you know, there may be some opportunities in North Carolina for like voting at home or voting by mail. Certainly some difficulties, right? You know, with being able to provide accessible voting for people who want to vote, you know, at home. Here in the Commonwealth, I'll start with voting by mail. There was an effort that started last year to make sure that we could provide an accessible ballot to individuals. And so we do have a contract with the vendor so that if someone does want an accessible ballot, they would be able to have that opportunity. And so that's the by mail option. However, the Commonwealth does not offer curbside voting. So for someone who wants to go in person to vote, they will actually have to go into the voting enclosure. And certainly there is an opportunity, with that for them to have assistance. If they want to, another option, I guess, is that if you do want to vote at home, there's another provision that allows you to get assistance, but that person has to sign, the declaration. So two different states, two different options. Neither are perfect, but certainly there is this interest in improving accessibility to voters. But I do think, in both cases, probably more work, can be done on both ends.
I'll jump in there. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that election laws differ from state to state. And as the secretary has just pointed out so well, 2 different states have 2 different systems. And we often talk about the fact that it makes it hard to do voter education and communications from state to state. I used to live in the Kansas City area, and if you're familiar with Kansas City, half of it's in Missouri and half of it's in Kansas. And how you could vote was completely different depending on where you lived, on which side of State Line Road, helpfully named. So that is doubled a millionfold when you're talking about folks who need assistive technologies, right? First of all, there's no one size fits all, just like in every other realm of elections. There is no one technology that you can provide, that will work with everything. Even if you have a ballot marking device, some people are going to be using the touch screen, some people are going to be using a keypad, some people are going to be using a sip and puff. Some people are going to have assistance, right? So there's all kinds of things that you need to take into account. And it requires a lot of different complexity. And that's something you can't get away from. If you're truly committed to accessibility, handling that variety and not being afraid of the complexity is important. At the same time, it makes it very difficult to get the word out to those populations that there are options available for them if there are different options at every county you go to or every state you go to or things like that. So we have a communication challenge there. The thing I think we have learned is that a single accessible voting machine sitting in a corner is not acceptable. This is the lesson from Separate but Equal, right? We learned it in Brown versus Board of Education. There is no way that if someone says, I have to go use that special machine over there because I don't have good dexterity or I can't hold a pencil very well, that's not going to be an acceptable way for them to vote, largely because sometimes those machines don't ever get set up. We still encounter local election offices who say, oh, we just don't have any voters with accessible needs in our jurisdiction. It's not true. They're just not showing up to vote because there aren't good ways for them to do it and feel comfortable and have that privacy and independence that's promised to them by our laws in this country. So if we've learned anything, I think that's where we've made progress. We understand that there needs to be open, multiple ways of voting for everyone and not to segregate off accessible voting, but really to provide multiple options for everyone. And the last thing I'll leave you with is just this anecdote. So I really love the phrase, we are all temporarily abled, because it reminds us that even if we don't think of ourselves as a person with disabilities, that may change tomorrow, that may change as we age. And I always point to my mother, who has pretty serious carpal tunnel and arthritis in her hands. She would never in a million years describe herself as someone with a disability. But if she's going to have to hold a pen and fill out a ballot that is 2 pages long, both sides, there's a significant chance that her hand is going to start to cramp and she's not going to fill out the down ballot races just because her hand hurts, right? That's an example of something where she would benefit from an accessible system, but she wouldn't categorize herself as someone with a disability. So I think it bears thinking about that, much like curb cuts and other accessible accommodations that have benefited everyone, even people who wouldn't normally think about themselves as a voter with disability. This really is something we need to think about for a broader population, not just for a small segment.
And just
I would also say language access is also important, right? Not just people with impairments and disability and people who are of age, but also language access is another segment, we're coming into, census 2020. Once, that data is finally released in September of this year. So we're already thinking about, will there be additional populations that we'll have to provide more information to, and documents and the ballots themselves in an alternative language other than English.
Yeah, just one quick point is the other thing that we really need to take a look at from an accessibility standpoint is the nimbleness and flexibility of our standards around it. And I'll give one quick anecdote around, in 2005, the original voluntary voting system guidelines, VVSG 1.0, had said that scrolling was not allowed, because at that time, the technology, we weren't used to iPhones. The iPhone wasn't out yet. We weren't used to smartphones. And so people weren't used to actually scrolling. And so, in order to make a change, here we are 15 years later, and the new VVSG is finally coming out. And so we need to build a more flexible standard and a more flexible, more nimble process by which we can change some of those requirements when we understand that they are no longer meeting the needs of the individual users and or not meeting the needs of the technology that we are all used to using. And so that is one thing that we really need to ensure that we have the opportunity to stay up on.
So I just want to add a small thing on top of this, which is that there's always an election official somewhere in the country trying something new and bold. And a lot of these ideas tend to spread around and get adopted. So Harris County, Houston, Texas, where I live, did two really cool things. They had mammoth tents for drive-through voting, because many people, not disability per se, but didn't want to leave their car because of COVID. So they allowed people to vote inside their cars at scale in huge parking lots. And the other thing that turned out to be really important is another sort of accessibility, which is not everybody can vote during the day. Some people who have shift work or aren't otherwise able to get away. They piloted some 24-hour voting centers, and they were insanely popular. People thought it was really cool to be able to go and vote at midnight. And there's some pushback from that in the State House, which I think is unfortunate. But I think these are ideas that will spread to other states and other counties around the country because they're good ideas. They help more people vote. And this notion of election officials trying to adopt best practices to the extent that they can because of state requirements is a big part of how we're going to get to accessibility for everybody.
Really very good. I want to turn to a question from the audience, and I'm going to look away and read it because I don't want to try and paraphrase it. I think it's really quite good. Secretary DeGraffenreid mentioned that the modernization process has been slow. Has that been deliberate to ensure that sufficient testing and trust are ensured, or has it been a matter of time and resources? And then when thinking about other countries, are there any lessons learned that can be applied in places looking to leapfrog in terms of electoral technologies? Nice meaty question. You can break off little pieces that you want it as you go. And we can start with you, Secretary, but it doesn't have to be just you.
Well, I'll start it off by saying that, sometimes things are slow just because sometimes it takes time. There are all different types of politics involved. Sometimes there was the fear of the unknown. So I'll give you an example. Going back to North Carolina, I started in North Carolina 2008 again, and very few states had online voter registration. I think Arizona and what was the other? Maybe Washington State. I don't know. They were the first, and like other states were looking at it. The people in North Carolina who were in charge at the time happened to be Democrats. So one would have thought, oh yeah, but they were not. So it was the fear of the unknown, like maybe this is just too much technology too quickly. And it literally was not until I believe last year, right before I left, a couple of years before that, I worked with the North Carolina DMV to help us put together at least some portion of online voter registration only going through the DMV portal. And then earlier in 2020, like right after I left, it was still done through the DMV. So it wasn't done by statute. It was done by the governor of that state, signing an executive order, basically saying, thou shalt DMV create this online voter registration. So, I mean, just think about that. How many years it took, for the 9th or 10th most populous state to get to online voter registration, when now, most states have something like that. So sometimes things take a while for just various reasons. And so, yes, resources also impact. Just making sure that you have, the funding, and also there's also this thing that really impacts elections administration, and I don't think there's anything that we can do about it. And the thing is called an election, and we tend to have a couple of those every single year. And so sometimes putting processes in place, the election gets in the way, just because you have that very narrow opportunity sometimes to deploy something new and different. So, those are, I guess, two of the barriers, just, lack of understanding and just reticence to move too quickly. Resources, those are the things that I believe that can impact modernization efforts.
Anybody else?
Yeah, just quickly, I'm just gonna, so resources, regulations, diversity, and what I'm gonna say about that is the diverse nature of elections. Monica had talked about this a little bit earlier, and so like the equitable nature of the way that most of our technology is purchased is usually at the very, very local level. And so again, that comes down to not just from a resource and a dollars and cents aspect, but it's also from a knowledge standpoint. Some municipalities may not have the resources in terms of personnel. We know that there is a lack and a shortage of technology experts that are out there and cybersecurity experts that are out there. And so the field is small. Same with the election administration field. And so just having the correct personnel in the right places. And then also, like I said, just the diversity and understanding of, the way that LA County and the way that LA County has built their own voting system is not going to work for, or may not work for a small jurisdiction. They may not be able to maintain their own software or their open source code because they don't have the engineers to be able to keep that up and keep it secure. And so we just need to understand that, we have, the number varies depending on who you talk to, but I'm going to use, anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 jurisdictions that independently purchase their election technology. And so the needs vary. And so it's not just the resource and regulation aspect of it, but also the diversity.
And Ryan, of course, going in terms of like VVSG, from VVSG to 1.0, the 2.0 that would take hours to explain like why that took so long, why that took 15 plus years. Of course, there wasn't a quorum, in the EAC for a number of years, and then it still took 6 years. And so that's a story for a later time. So I think that would, just maybe the regulatory process can slow things down.
The other thing to keep in mind when we talk about standards, though, is just having a new standard isn't enough, right? That's the first step. And without that, you can't make any progress. So I know many of us in the elections world are just thrilled that there is a new standard finally, since the old one was introduced before the iPhone, as I think Ryan mentioned. So it's great to have it, but there actually wasn't an interim between 1.0 and 2.0. There was an interim 1.5, and no one certified to it. There is still not a system certified to it, even though it's been a number of years for it since it came out. And so it's important to remember that just because the voluntary standard exists, then you need time for testing labs to be accredited to actually certify systems to the standard. And you need to actually have vendors build new systems that will meet the standard. 2.0 in particular is ambitious and I think has a lot of good things in there, but there are also a couple of wrinkles that are going to make it difficult, and manufacturers are going to need time to work that out. In addition, the EAC has said they don't expect systems to be certified to the new standard for 2 to 3 years, Well, guess what? 2 to 3 years puts us right up against the 2024 presidential cycle. And in general, election officials are usually pretty reticent to go to totally new voting equipment right before a presidential. So we're actually probably pushing 2025, 2026 before people really go into an update cycle. And that's if they have the funding left over from these federal grants, which are really the only way to purchase multi-million-dollar systems. Even for a medium-sized county, this is a multi-million-dollar purchase. So it's not small change, and it's not something that can be done without a lot of thought, but it's going to be a while before we have systems even certified to the new standard.
Yeah, they say that you shouldn't wait until you shouldn't wait to fix your roof until it's raining, but I think when you're an election official, it's always raining elections. So I can understand the challenge. Getting word that one of our former panelists today is with us, David Becker from the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and he just has a brief comment he'd like to share. David? Does the technology work? Can we make that work for him? And I guess the answer is no. I apologize, David. I guess Zoom was not as flexible as we thought it would be. Please do share that if you can through text, then I can make that available. Last sort of speed round going around the room. Obviously, the big issue that we've seen in after the 2016 election is this notion of cybersecurity, especially with regard to outside threats to the voting process. Just really quickly, knowing full well that you won't be able to do justice to it, thoughts on how both current and future iterations of voting technology can help harden our system against outside threats? Dan, maybe I'll let you jump in first.
Sure. So the notion that a nation state adversary might throw everything they've got at trying to manipulate our election outcomes is a daunting task to defend against, because every state and every county with different rules and different regulations and different technologies, you can't just fix it in one place and you're good. So that also makes it a little bit harder to attack because you can't just attack it in one place. But nonetheless, the attacker almost always has the advantage in these kinds of games. The place where DHS has been engaging with states and counties to help improve their security of their IT systems, I think is really important. I would love to see the EAC get into the business of certifying e-poll books and other aspects of electronic voting beyond just the machines. Every place where there's a computer, there's a potential role for certification, and we can't wait another decade to get another standard. So we might need to move more quickly than we have in the past on standards efforts. But the thing that's the most fascinating about this is how it's become a military issue. There are a very small number of articles where you can read about US Cyber Command hacking back at foreign countries that have been trying to hack us. So that's like, it's not the usual way you think about running and managing and defending an election, that we have soldiers hacking foreign adversaries to disable them during our elections. But that's part of the game, which is, it's one of these mind-exploding kinds of things to wrap your head around. But the good news is that for the most part, our elections are offline, and that we have paper ballots in increasing numbers of counties, and there's nothing that a foreign nation state adversary can do to reach in and change ink on paper. You can't change that over the internet. And that's a big part of why I think internet voting is nowhere near prime time. So it's a real challenge, and we haven't even begun to talk about disinformation. Maybe instead of hacking the voting machines, I'm going to hack the voters' brains. That's a whole other challenge that honestly, I have no idea how we're supposed to deal with.
So really quickly, I'll just throw some words out here, and Monica touched on them. lots of testing, pre-election testing, post-election testing, audit, reconciliation, accountability, physical security, chain of custody, common sense, right? That's the approach. And all of those things that everyone else has said, but like, you know, those are key to elections administration. And sometimes it really is back to basics, just making sure that the numbers add up any way you slice and dice it, and having transparency throughout the process.
Ryan?
Yeah, 2 words, just transparency and resilience. And so, you know, the commission had built a lot of that into their recommendations is, you know, having evidence-based elections, having the voter verified paper audit trail, suggesting auditing, suggesting testing. And so building all these pieces of evidence can show the truth. And to Dan's point about mis and disinformation, you know, there are ways that we can, you know, be transparent, show the evidence and provide the information, but we can't guarantee that the confidence is going to be built or that the trust is going to be there. But we as elections officials can do what we can do to ensure that we have the tracking, the testing, and then that we are telling our story. And it is incumbent upon our electorate to understand and you know, provide those transparency mechanisms for, you know, the electorate to start building the trust back in the process and having confidence in what we do.
And Monica, just because you waited your turn, you get the last word before I turn it over to my colleague, John Williams.
Well, I'll mention 2 things really quickly. The first is that, and you know, Dan and anyone else who's been involved in programming or software or information technology understands that when we talk about cybersecurity, there is no such thing as perfect security. So when we talk about protecting against threats, we're not so much talking about protection. Of course, you want to make it as hard as possible for someone to attack your system, but because there is no perfect protection, the more important point to really get right is detection and remediation. So that's one of the reasons why we audit. It's also one of the reasons why an audit needs to be able to change the result if an error is found, right? I think we're starting to see audits that are well after certification and are really sort of more press moments and media storms rather than actual audits that are done in a timely fashion and could actually impact the outcome if they found anything. And that's not really the route we want to go down. The other thing that I will mention is simplicity. As our elections continue to become more complex, it is incumbent upon all of us to narrow that scope down, to constantly be trying to make things simpler. Why? Because elections are human processes, and whenever you have humans involved, even if it's the humans who are programming your voting machines, those are still humans, right, that are writing the code or programming the election. The more complex it is, the more likely there are errors. And that's not even an attack, that's just a natural human error. And we have sort of let the complexity get a little bit out of hand. And 2016 and everything becoming critical infrastructure and every election official having to become a cybersecurity expert overnight, and then to train all their staff and then to train all their poll workers. I mean, things balloon. And that was a necessary scope increase, but it was a scope increase. And so I will remind us all that there's a reason election officials love checklists. There's a reason election officials love color coding, and it's the same reason the medical profession does, right? When you're dealing with high-risk situations and there's lots of stress and maybe not enough sleep, and humans are responsible for making sure it's done correctly, making sure everything is as simple as possible, and that you're not relying on a stressed, sleep-deprived human's brain to make sure you get everything right. You're just following a checklist and making sure that you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. Even those kind of simple process improvements are incredibly helpful to make sure we don't miss things. And so as much as we think about defending against nation state actors, making sure we can find out if something has happened, and that's the auditing process, and then relentlessly making the whole process simpler from every direction that we can is going to make our elections more secure.
I want to thank you to the panel and on behalf of all stressed and sleep deprived people everywhere. Especially this stressed and occasionally sleep deprived person. I want to thank you for joining us today. The goal of these events has been to promote a reasoned and thoughtful discussion of issues, and you all have absolutely not disappointed. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to turn it over to my colleague, John Williams of the Becker Institute for some farewell words and indication of coming attractions. John?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to Doug and to the panel. It was a wonderful discussion. And thanks to everybody who joined today's discussion. These are the type of thoughtful conversations that we think will, with hopes, can stir the brand of bipartisan approach that will be needed to help us address the challenges facing our election systems in the future. Please join us again for our 5th and final webinar that starts at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, June the 2nd. The topic of that webinar will be opportunities and challenges for election reform. Until then, on behalf of the Carter Center and the Becker Institute, we hope you will stay healthy and make sure you get your vaccinations. And we hope to see you again on June 2nd. Thank you and good day.